All right, Keith, we are live. I'm excited to be here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. We're talking about scale and Amazon businesses.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I realize now that the Freudian slip, I said tonight, it is night where I am out in Europe, but you're in New York City, midday. I hear you guys have some nice weather right now.
We do have nice weather. You can see I have a timer on my, I turn night here for me automatically. I can move around so I can actually have it be daytime. But yes,
that's cool.
Afternoon for us.
Well, guys, the chat box is live, so thanks to everybody who's already joined. We'd love to see you in the chat box. The reason we do live webinars as opposed to recorded webinars is so that we can hear from you and we can kind of tailor the content of this conversation to what you guys want to hear about. So we've got Amelia from Jungle Scout who's on duty tonight. She volunteered to take charge of the chat box. She's going to be talking to you guys in the chat box and relaying some of that information to me so that we can make sure that we're covering whatever it is that's important to you. So if you have joined us today, it'd be wonderful to hear from you in the chat box. Let us know where you're joining from so we can get a bit of an idea of where the audience is coming from, what the audience's concerns are. But just in the, the next 2 minutes or so while we're waiting on the rest of the audience to show up, it's only 1 minute past the hour. It's interesting to talk a little bit of Amazon news, huh, Keith? The big buy, Amazon buying Whole Foods. What do you think?
It's interesting. I mean, it's Amazon's biggest acquisition by, I think, 14x. So it's a big move by Amazon, and I think it's super interesting to pay attention to.
Yeah, and the real interesting question, of course, for all of us Amazon sellers that are joining this webinar today, the question for us is this going to be beneficial for us? What does it mean? Does it mean anything to us? Maybe we are or are not selling groceries. But from my perspective, I don't know what yours is, Keith. My perspective, all I'm seeing is that Amazon is continuing on the trajectory that Jeff Bezos has set them on for a number of years now. And I just think it means there's going to be a steady market for FBA sellers for a long time to come.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it's, if forget what the potential strategy and how that might impact sellers and all of us in this ecosystem, but it's a good sign that we have hitched our wagon to a platform that is growing, that is aggressive. Bezos still thinks it's day one there at Amazon. It's pretty rare to have a CEO that is the founding CEO who, this many years in is still as aggressive and moving as quickly and hardcore as he is. So it really is impressive.
Yeah, it's a pretty exciting time. So guys, to get to the content today, and we want to jump right in. Thank you for everyone who's joined us. Welcome to this podcast, or this webinar rather. We are going to be talking all about scaling and growing your Amazon business. And if you are anything like me, those who have attended, you're an Amazon seller and you're eager to grow and scale your business, but it's also one of the most challenging aspects of running a business. Sometimes it's easy to get started, but what to do from there is a little bit harder question. So let's just jump into some introductions. For people who don't know me, I'm Shane. I'm the director of Fetcher. Hopefully I know a lot of those that are in the chat box right now. I see comments coming up and I recognize a lot of names. It's good to see everyone. But for people who don't know anything about me, my background was in tech. I worked in Silicon Valley for a couple of big tech firms before I became an Amazon seller, before I found this dream of becoming my own boss and building an FBA business. I built an FBA business and then later partnered with Greg Mercer to build Fetcher. And Fetcher is that accounting tool that makes bookkeeping easy for all Amazon sellers. So personally, I am still a very active private label seller on Amazon. So I'd say personally, there is no topic that's more interesting to me than scale and growth. So I'm focused on that with my own business. I'm a 6-figure seller at the moment, but the goal is always to become bigger and better. I'd love to be a 7-figure seller by the end of the year. That's one of my goals. So personally, I am really glad to welcome our friend Keith Smith, who's joining us. Keith is the CEO of Payability, and I'm going to let him talk a little bit more about that. But what you guys need to know about Keith is that he's a serial entrepreneur who has started and scaled several businesses. So he's truly an expert when it comes to scale and growth, and we're going to focus on the Amazon side of the house, and he knows a lot about that as the CEO of Payability. Keith, thanks so much for joining us today. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, so a little bit about me. You mentioned I've started a number of businesses. Some of them have been extremely successful and some of them have not. So I've been able to kind of see both sides. But every business that I've started has always had an eye towards how do we scale? How do we actually make this repeatable? I like to say, how do we make money while you're sleeping? Not that indicates in any way that this business will be easy, but certainly creating an environment, creating a structure for a business that is scalable. And what I find extremely rewarding about Payability right now is that we now get to support a whole lot of businesses that are also trying to create a business that is scalable, that is really truly going to be sustainable long term, and a whole lot of entrepreneurs who are making money while they sleep, because Amazon never stops, and as they supply Amazon and we supply those suppliers with capital, then that flywheel continues to turn, and we're really excited to see a whole lot of our partners and our customers growing really, really rapidly.
Absolutely. And so the key focus tonight is on scale. So we brought in Mr. Keith to talk about this subject matter. And right now he's going to be priming up a presentation that we're going to use to kind of categorically take us through some of the things that he thinks are most important. So Keith is going to be sharing his screen in a second. And before I do turn it over to him to get into this content a little bit more detail, I just want to say that this is a marketplace that is becoming more and more competitive. And I know that people listening to this are probably can resonate with that idea that starting an Amazon business today is harder than it was years ago. And it's a little bit more complicated in terms of the competitive nature of the environment that's about. You're going to find lots of other people who are building private label businesses, possibly private labeling the same products that you are. And it's a bit of a stressor. It's a challenge. And so when I'm thinking about how to be successful in the Amazon marketplace, to me, the number one thing I can do to be successful is to scale my business, to grow my business. And that is going to help me compete with those people that are private labeling products just like me. So if I can add 100 products before a person can add 10, the likelihood is that I'm going to be able to hedge my bets across those 100 products and continue to scale. We saw in the Jungle Scout survey that was recently published. Hopefully people had a chance to see that. If not, please mention that in the comments, and Amelia, I'm sure, can dig it up and put it in the chat box for us. But in that survey, which was about the largest survey I've ever seen done of FBA sellers, one big takeaway for me was that scale and growth was the number one success factor or factor that led to people having success. Those people who had persevered over a year or two as Amazon sellers and had a nice trajectory and learned to scale and grow their business, they managed to outcompete and beat off all of the competition. So that's what we're talking about today. Keith, I'm not quite seeing your screen yet. Have you started to share yet?
I was waiting for the clue there. So
sorry, great. So as I said, Keith is going to start. There we go. Nice. Keith, I'll turn it over to you now, man. Why don't you give us a little bit of more introduction and get the slide deck rolling, and we'll start the conversation.
Fantastic. Yeah, so I appreciate the intro, a little bit more about me, and more importantly, a little bit about our company. I started my career in finance. I then moved to tech and spent the bulk of my career starting tech companies. A number of companies that I was involved in are in the adtech space, so very familiar with digital marketing, with the digital marketing ecosystem, and also with finance. And really that led me to the original thesis that we had, myself and our co-founder, Scott Lynn. We both saw this in different scenarios where there were digital marketplaces that were cropping up all over the place. And really the promise of a digital marketplace is to be able to handle the demand side of the equation so that their suppliers can then just focus on supply. The challenge is that those suppliers are typically being paid slower than they want to be paid and slower than their business really demands that they are paid. And so as a result, then they either need to raise outside capital or find some other source of financing in order to really be able to scale their business. So our thesis was pretty simple. Let's set out to be able to figure out how to be able to solve that and provide reliable financing solutions for sellers and suppliers of digital marketplaces. And
Keith, sorry, I just want to interrupt you and say that's a wonderful point. I talk with Amazon sellers every day as the director of Fetcher, and one of the biggest challenges I hear from people about is about finances. People are always asking, should I be raising money? Should I wait and see success in 1 or 2 or 3 products, private label products, before I start to reinvest? And everybody has this goal of scale and growth. But one of the biggest things that sets them back or holds them back is the financial side. How do I finance a new FBA product? How do I get that going? What are some of the solutions out there? So I'm glad to hear that you guys are tackling that very difficult challenge.
Yeah, and we certainly we address a part of that, but it's not. It doesn't solve all of that. And so what I want to talk about today, is more general kind of growth strategies. Talk a little bit about payability, but also we'll talk about other solutions, other financing solutions, and certainly don't intend to make it a payability commercial. So we really want to talk more about just what are some really great strategies for being able to scale a seller business in today's world.
Great. Okay. Well, let's dive into the content then.
Great. So topics that we'll talk about. I kind of mentioned a couple of these, but the kind of the key pieces of scaling, how to figure out what are your strategies and what are your good scalable growth strategies. One of the things that I talk about a lot too is how profit is more important than margin, and so that's a theme that you'll hear come up several times and as we talk about these various strategies. And then also just talking about not just a one-time financing solution, but how do we create positive cash flow and figure out how to be able to make this your business and the growth of your business to be sustainable and to be able to continue to grow over a long period of time. And then we'll just talk about some of the tips for then once you figure out how to be able to make that work, how can we replicate that into other products, etc. So those are kind of the main topics that I figured would be helpful for today.
Yeah, fantastic. Those are all topics that I'm going to be interested to hear more about, and I know the audience will be too.
So scale, simply, just kind of think about what it is. It is that activity that's going to spur growth, and of course, as we talked about, we want it to be repeatable. 5 of the kind of the key elements that we've identified, and in our perspective, by the way, comes from us being able to work with a wide variety of Amazon sellers. So we get to see Amazon sellers across a variety of different product categories, et cetera. But we also get to see suppliers in other verticals as well. So we tend to do a fair amount of pattern matching and seeing what is working across verticals, what is working across product categories within Amazon. And of course, we never share any sort of confidential information, but we end up gaining a lot of insight, I think, especially from seeing some of our suppliers and sellers that are growing very, very rapidly. So these insights didn't come from the genius mind of anybody here at Payability, but really more from the experiences and what we've seen from our sellers who are doing really, really well.
Great. So it sounds like there's really 5 key strategies that we're going to be focusing on today. And as I look across the line at all of these, inventory jumps out at me as something that a lot of Amazon sellers struggle with in the early days, because a lot of us haven't had experience with logistics and inventory in the past. And now all of a sudden we slap this label on ourselves. We claim to be entrepreneurs and we have to do all this stuff, but inventory is pretty tough. Is that where you're going to start today, Keith?
Definitely where we're going to start. And really we could probably focus, 10 hours just on inventory, because you're right, that is critical to everything. And that's it, to a large degree, that is the core of everything that a seller needs to provide. Amazon's handling the demand side. It's up to the seller to figure out the supply or the inventory side of things. So really talking about how do we build up the inventory and keep it going, keep your turnover high, etc. Optimizing price. We'll talk about pricing and some strategies that we've seen that work well there. Advertising, and then some negotiation ideas and concepts that we've seen our sellers have reported back to us that have worked very well for them. And then just talking about how we take those things now and then start to expand and really create a scalable, sustainable business.
Man, this is exciting stuff. Let's dive into inventory.
All right. So inventory management, one of the topics that we hear about regularly is just the challenge of getting out of stock. And when you look at the whether Amazon's reporting this to you or you're just seeing from your own stats or you're using other third-party tools, the biggest lost opportunity that we see over and over again is sellers that are running out of inventory, and as a result, they're not able to actually sell their products. And they have this kind of lumpy. They'll have product and they'll have inventory that'll sell out. Then they get paid every 2 weeks. Then they turn around and they buy more inventory. And so being able to figure out how to be able to monitor those low stock warnings from within your Amazon Seller Central dashboard, and then making sure that you act before they become out of stock. Go ahead. You were gonna.
Yeah, I was just going to say that for people who are using Fetcher right now, we are about to offer a new notification that's going to notify people when they're out of stock. So that'll help with number 1.
That is great, and I got to say that it's so critical to be able to for the buy box, and if you are if you're private label, you're kind of always winning the buy box, but you definitely don't want to be training consumers that that your product is sometimes in stock and sometimes out of stock. So one of the things that we see from sellers that is working extremely well is those sellers who are able to buy in relatively small lots. So that they can take the cash flow from their sales, turn it back around, and be able to buy more inventory. And that way they can keep relatively small amounts of inventory at all times, rather than having massive amounts of inventory with Amazon or in your own warehouse. And at the same time, being able to make sure that you have a cadence where you're not actually going to be running out of stock.
Yeah, that's a great strategy. I made the mistake early on of buying large bulk because I thought I was going to get a better rate, and I did get a better rate. But then I also ended up paying Amazon fees for oversized inventory that was being kept in fulfillment centers beyond the defined life period. So beyond 6 months, I was paying overages, and that's just a mess because every month we're paying storage fees in Amazon. And then every 6 months, you're going to pay for anything that's been in inventory longer than 6 months. I think that is the strategy that people should really be thinking about when they're talking about how to best utilize their Amazon inventory.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And certainly there are some product categories that just require, the suppliers there are going to require that you buy in in large bulk purchases. But certainly if that can be avoided, then you're going to not have to tie up as much capital. You're going to be able to avoid those fees from Amazon from keeping your supply there and your inventory there at Amazon for too long. And hopefully then it allows you to be able to then continue to replenish that inventory and replenish it as you go along, rather than having to buy a big chunk all at once.
Right. And then the other critical component of this is just understanding and analyzing your sales velocity, recognizing how much product you're moving on a regular basis and utilizing that to forecast how your inventory is going to need to be managed. So the small batch plan, I think, is the best plan. I know for one of my products off the top of my head, it's a light bulb product that for me, it makes the most sense to keep about 1,000 units in inventory on large orders. So I never order more than 1,000 units of inventory because I know about what the selling rate of that product is. It's about 10 to 15 per day. I know what my lead time is to manufacture them and get them back in shipment. So for me, affordably, it makes the most sense to only order about 1,000 every time I reorder. And so those are the kind of things that sellers need to be thinking about. Once again, the Fetcher dashboard will help notify people well in advance of when they're going to be out of stock and give them the notification based off of what they enter in when it comes to like lead time, for example. So they're going to enter in their lead time, and then there'll be a little quick calculation that's completed. That way people can have a bit of a better understanding. Because I know for me personally, Keith, I check my inventory levels every single day because it can get out of hand quickly and inventory becomes expensive. And I've seen it shut down several FBA businesses. So I'm glad we were talking inventory to start.
Absolutely. And that second bullet there that says use Amazon's tools better, it should say use Fetcher's tools better. Because waiting for those, making sure that you are tapped into the notifications so that you know when you need to be restocking, when you need to be getting more inventory, that really is critical to be able to maintain that inventory. And hopefully you can maintain relatively small inventory levels as you go along, but you're replenishing them on a regular basis.
Great. Okay, so that's inventory. Let's move to the next strategy, which I think is pricing.
Yes. So I'll start out with, and this is something that we hear from a lot of our sellers, especially when they launch a new product or when they first started selling. The thing that we hear that works well is to start at a price that is lower maybe than what you would ideally like to be priced at ultimately, but that allows you to be able to then tap into the volume and to be able to, and while you may sacrifice some profit and certainly some margin in the short term, the ability to be able to then win those sales over the long run is really helped by pricing that lower and then incrementally kind of inching yourself up. And of course, paying a lot of attention to what other folks are pricing, whether they are selling the same ASIN or if they're selling a similar type product, and if you are blessed enough or have you've been using the strategy to have private label type products.
Yeah, that's great. And while we're talking pricing, I still want to kind of coincide this conversation with inventory because there has still been quite a bit of activity in the chat box relating to inventory. And to answer Patty's question, Patty's curious about how to set price and how to manage inventory for seasonal products. And that can be a real challenge. And Patty, I think the answer is it really comes down to understanding your sales velocity per season. So what does your sales velocity look like in the fall? What does it look like in the summer? And then maintaining only as much inventory as you need to meet demand. That's really the challenge here. You know, we're talking about a balance between pricing and inventory that allows you to meet demand and to never go down below. But you've mentioned that there might be an opportunity to just, you know, let the inventory run out and then re-kick the product again when the season starts. If it's a highly seasonal product, you know, if you're selling Christmas tree ornaments, then potentially those aren't going to sell at all in the summer. And so that's a decision that you'd have to make based off of supply and demand. If there's just no demand for the product in the summer, then I would absolutely let it go out of stock because I don't want to be paying Amazon hefty prices for managing that stuff in Amazon's fulfillment centers. But let's get back on track as we're talking about pricing and how to go forward with that pricing strategy, Keith.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And on that topic, I would say that for every one of these suggestions or recommendations and kind of experiences that we've seen that we're passing along, there's almost always an inverse to each of these rules. And so while we see a lot of suppliers that are pricing aggressively, buying in small batches, et cetera, we also see that there are some suppliers that, especially before we start to work with them, that don't have the cash to be able to buy a lot of product. And as a result, it likely makes more sense for them, especially if they are not going to be able to replenish that inventory quickly, to maybe price higher. You're going to have your sales volume likely go down relatively significantly, but at the same time, then you are going to increase your margin. But when in kind of normal standard operating procedure, I would say that optimizing for profit makes an awful lot more sense than margin. And I like to illustrate this with just a simple illustration, which is that if I could sell one widget for $10 that I have a margin of 50% on, so I'm going to make $5 on that. That's kind of scenario one. I would much rather sell 3 widgets where I had a profit margin of only 30%. So in one scenario, I'm going to have a gross profit of 5, and the other one I'm going to have a gross profit of 9. And so if you can lower your margin, but then ultimately increase your profit, especially if you are able to increase the sales velocity and of course your inventory turns, then you are going to end up making more profit. And we should be thinking about optimizing for profit, not necessarily optimizing just for margin.
Yeah, that's a huge point to drive home, that we want profits to drive our business. So now it almost seems that we've gotten into this conversation of, well, how do we use pricing to influence and control our inventory? I think we only want to do that in a desperate situation. So not something that's a best practice. Generally speaking, we would want to optimize for profits, set really good forecasts, and understand what our sales velocity is like, and then manage our inventory that way. So there was another question in the chat box, Keith, and this question comes from Lucy, and Lucy was asking, so if cash flow isn't too much of an issue, maybe she's already got a sizable business, should she still be thinking about ordering in batches? And my answer is that depends on the pricing that you're getting from your suppliers, and how much cost that you're saving by getting larger orders versus how much you're paying in storage fees at Amazon. But generally speaking, it is still better to manage your inventory in small batches without having to use pricing too much, because as Keith said, we want to optimize pricing for profits. We can't afford to be lowering our prices and raising our prices just to preserve inventory. That's the wrong way to be thinking about doing the business. We want our inventory to work for us rather than our pricing to work for our inventory, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's well said. I completely agree with that. And certainly, if you can optimize for both margin and profit, then you're in a wonderful spot. But even those businesses that are well capitalized, they still need to be thinking about their usage of their capital and their cost of capital and what the opportunity cost is for that capital. So if you can buy in smaller batches, have faster turnover, have a higher velocity of your inventory, then generally speaking, that is going to generate more profits. And it is very product specific because some products just aren't going to fit that. But by and large, that's definitely the strategy that we see that wins.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we just have a question from Andrew. I just want to make sure what he's got to say here and that I'm clarifying the question correctly because it looks like it could be helpful from everyone. He's basically asking, like, what is the most effective way to generate reviews to get your final price point? It sounds to me like he wants to know how to price his products. And that's a challenging question to answer. Keith, you got any thoughts on how best to be pricing products in general?
Well, I would say that one of the great things that Amazon does for the end customer is that they make it very easy to be able to see all the various prices of all the various sellers, as well as the various different related or similar type products. And so when you think about pricing, I think you always have to think about it, especially in the Amazon world, in relation to what the competitive pressures are and how the competition is pricing. So if the competition is pricing and there's very thick margins, maybe you can skinny your margins just a little bit more than them, and you can still make a really nice margin. But it's what are your supply costs and what are your competitors doing in terms of pricing are kind of really the two biggest inputs to what your ultimate pricing strategy will be.
Great. Okay. Well, let me just take one more look in the chat box just because pricing is a hot topic, just to see if there are any fresh questions on this. Looks like everybody's comfortable with the content that's being presented, which is a good sign. So we're going to move on to our next strategy, which is about advertising.
Let me make one comment on the win in the buy box. I know it's not necessarily applicable to a whole lot of folks who are private label. You are blessed to always win the buy box in many of those cases. However, if you're not, I like to think about the buy box kind of in relation to the SEO wars of 10, 15 years ago, where in that world, though, if you were competing for tops, search engine results, if you're the top 1, 2, or 3, then that's where you're going to get the bulk of the traffic, and then it kind of falls off from there. In this case with Amazon, it's even more concentrated in the number 1 choice wins. There's not a lot of people who are then going beyond the buy box to be able to buy who's lower down. So the sales fall off dramatically. So if you're going to be embracing the strategy of high velocity and optimizing for profit, not for margin, then that indicates also that you really should be having a strategy where you are focusing on winning the buy box or having a private label product strategy.
Great. Yeah, I'm glad we didn't skip over that. No, I'm sure there are people here today who are thinking about the buy box on a regular basis. Glad we touched on that. But now I think we can talk PPC and internal advertisements or external. Let's see what you got on advertising, Keith.
And I would actually love to hear your take on this. We get to see advertising from our perspective. We pay a lot of attention to advertising because in our world, where we are advancing funds to suppliers based on what their sales were previously, then we also pay attention to the things that can decrease the amount that Amazon would otherwise pay. So advertising is obviously one of those areas where it's in our business called a contra accounting item. So it is going to reduce the payout, and Amazon is paying directly to Payability because we've already advanced those funds to our sellers. So we pay attention to advertising. And we tend to see what works and what doesn't work, but it's not necessarily core to our strategy. I know that you have a lot of insight into it. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Definitely. From my perspective, Amazon sponsored advertisements, pay per click, are an absolute must. Amazon sellers really need to optimize their campaigns and run successful pay-per-click campaigns. I regularly meet people who've got nice, steady businesses in the Amazon space and just have never turned on pay-per-click because they've got such a good product that it's getting several organic sales per day, and they've just been comfortable with that until a competitor pops up. And you can't imagine how quickly a competitor can top your product if they've outpaced you with the internal advertising systems that Amazon's built, this pay-per-click as we call it. So I think it's a phenomenal system. I think it takes a lot of mastery, not enough time today to go into what is required to be really, really good at those internal advertisements. But I do have a resource for people today. Amelia is going to drop in the chat box right now an ebook that we've just published. I'm really excited about this ebook because it's the longest and probably the best ebook we've ever done. Now, I agree that we should never say in more words than we can say in less, but pay-per-click is just that complex that it took us 56 pages. I'm not kidding. You've got a miniature novel on your hands here, but it's probably the best free resource I've ever come across. And I can say that honestly. So Amelia is going to post that now. So for people who really want to get better at pay-per-click, want to enhance their strategy, want to outcompete using internal Amazon advertising, this is the best solution for you to just dig in. But Keith, to your question, it's just critical. I can't say anything more than the fact that it is critical. I know that at least a third of my sales on a daily basis I can attribute to Amazon pay-per-click. So it's a wonderful system for people. But in terms of the financial side and getting paid, it is a little trickier, as you said, because it's a totally different system than the system that pays you from Amazon.
Yeah. And just to reiterate too, what you're saying is that we see a very high correlation between those sellers who have a good pay-per-click strategy and those that are growing and scaling really rapidly. That doesn't mean that all pay-per-click strategies are devised the same, because you can definitely, and we've seen sellers end up spending money that wasn't effective and end up wasting money. But those that are really paying attention, those that are actually having a smart pay-per-click strategy, they tend to be the ones who are growing rapidly. And it's also, to your point, it's a really great defensive move to make sure that a competitor doesn't come along and suddenly usurp you, because if you can have a strategy and a margin and a profit picture in mind that takes into account your pay-per-click strategy, then you will be much better defended against competitors as they come along.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself. It is critical that it's optimized. I guess I didn't say that clearly enough. It's not enough to just turn these campaigns on and let them run. They really need to be refined. And there's a lot of software out there that can help you with this. I'm not going to recommend any today because I personally don't use any. Personally, I trust in my own abilities to manipulate the keywords in Seller Central. So that's what I do on a near daily basis. I make small refinements to my advertisements, and I use the strategy in that ebook so people can take a look. But let's continue on, Keith.
Great. So negotiating better inventory costs. This is one where, again, if you're kind of buying into this strategy where you're trying to do high volume, you're focusing on profit, not necessarily on margin. You are winning the buy box, or you have a private label strategy. You're using advertising in order to be able to drive up your sales even higher. What that ultimately will turn into then is it gives you buying power. It gives you as a seller the ability to be able to turn around, typically to your sellers, and of course it is a bit supplier and product dependent, but in the vast majority of cases, you will then have the buying power to be able to turn around and negotiate terms. So maybe you can pay over time, or just negotiate better pricing based on both the volume and from our perspective, one of the things that we see a lot and that gets reported back to us is because our suppliers, our sellers are getting paid faster, they're getting paid daily based on their sales the prior day, they're able to take those faster payments and turn around and be able to pay their suppliers faster. That also gives them negotiating leverage. And in many cases, we hear that from sellers that they're able to negotiate prices that give them a bigger discount than what our fee is in order to be able to provide the financing for them. So there are scenarios like that where you really get this virtuous cycle of being able to sell more. That gives you buying power. You get paid on a daily basis. That gives you buying power. You can negotiate better rates, and it actually increases your margin and certainly increases your profit.
Oh, that's a really wonderful technique. I'd never actually thought about that, but it makes sense. And it does resonate with me that if you had increased buying power, the ability to continually refine prices and negotiate with suppliers, I mean, your influence, your leverage has gone up significantly if you're making more regular purchases. So now we're talking about, small batches in terms of a strategy, and we're talking about small, quick batches because we've got significant buying power because of services like Payability. So that's a pretty fantastic approach. One other technique that I like to use when I'm negotiating with suppliers is I like to look at my refund rate or my return rate over the last period of that specific product. And then I'll actually take a snapshot of my little refund section in Fetcher, and I will share that portion of the dashboard with my supplier and say, hey, look, my refunds are at such and such a rate. It's costing me this much money. And I know that at least 25% of those refunds are based off of quality. What can you do for me? And I almost always have favorable results from using that little approach.
That's a great idea. I love that. And a lot of times I think we as owners of businesses, we tend to, as problems come along, we think, how can I solve this myself? And sometimes the best way to solve those is to make sure there's visibility into that problem and making sure that in your supply chain, your suppliers know about those problems, and it can be a great negotiating tactic to maybe improve quality and maybe improve your pricing.
Right. And so we're talking about supply chain management here. If we had executives from large companies, large logistics companies and product companies, that's what they would call this, supply chain management. But for Amazon sellers, it's relatively new topic. I know personally, I never worked in supply chain before. So this is all stuff that we're having to revise and go through for the first time together as newly branded entrepreneurs, as Amazon sellers. So it's something that you just have to get your feelers out there with and try. These strategies do work. Negotiating with suppliers is an important part of running a good Amazon business. Lowering costs so that you can improve margins and so you can outperform competitors. So it's a continued practice. As I talk about supply chain, I hope it doesn't send people running, or people don't get a little bit scared off of the fact like, I don't know how to manage a supply chain. In reality, people in this webinar today do know how to manage a supply chain because you're doing it with your Amazon business. It's just about continuing to get out there every single day and negotiating and taking advantage of these little strategies that Keith's been sharing with us.
Yeah, it's a great point. If you are at a big Fortune 500 companies, you're going to use, great buzzwords. You're going to talk about just-in-time, inventory and et cetera. But it's funny because as I talk to sellers all the time, and many of them would be deemed by those Fortune 500 executives to be non-sophisticated. Maybe there's somebody who used to be a homemaker. Maybe there's somebody who just graduated from college. Maybe there's somebody who had a different career and they decided to now start selling on Amazon. Maybe you started part-time and now they're full-time. I talk to folks like that in many cases, they are just as sophisticated in terms of the tools they're using, the inventory management, the turnovers, how they're paying attention to their margin and ultimately to their profit, as many of those Fortune 500 executives. So it really is interesting that there is this entire kind of army of folks that didn't come from logistics, didn't come from supply chain management, that are becoming supply chain management experts without even really realizing what they're becoming an expert in.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that gets me fired up about being an Amazon seller, because you have to be somebody who can and do a little bit of all of these things. And the big advantage that we have over the Fortune 500 companies is passion. Well, we care about our businesses because we see the bottom line coming through in our balance sheets every single day and in our profit and loss pages, and it affects us and it affects our livelihood. So I know that when I worked for Fortune 500 companies, I'd go in from 8 to 5 and potentially not always give my best effort. But when it comes to my own personal product, you can bet that I'm going to become the best negotiator with suppliers as I could possibly be. I think we have that advantage over large organizations. So there's no reason that people listening today can't be wonderful supply chain managers, just like those who have the job title in a Fortune 500 company. But enough on my high horse about how great Amazon sellers are. What about expanding your business? How can we truly expand and grow our business more, Keith?
So I think, one of the formulas that we've seen work very well is sellers who start with a relatively small number of products, either that or a relatively small number of product categories, figure out how to be able to get that supply chain working for them, figure out how to be able to get their inventory, figuring out how to be able to win the buy box, making sure that they have sellers that are, or suppliers that are reliable, and that they can actually start to get this turnover working, and then take that formula and now start to repeat it with other products. And Amazon does a good job of, once you start to get traction in a particular category, it'll do a good job of telling you what other products you should be thinking about. What are other high demand products that they're having a hard time getting inventory in? They're very much in, their interests are aligned with the sellers in this case, where they want sellers to be providing these products that are in high demand, that are difficult to find. And if you can get your hands on those products, then you're going to have a product without a lot of competition and likely with relatively good margins. So figuring it out with a small number of products, and then figuring out then how to be able to scale and repeat that over and over again. And it becomes easier with each additional product that you layer on because of the experiences and the lessons that you've learned with the previous ones.
That's the huge point right there. You hit the nail on the head. If you've done it once, you can do it 10 times. You can do it 100 times. You can do it 1,000 times. We've got Fetcher customers with thousands of private label products. I'm not kidding you. They're making 7 figures per week. And what have they done? They've done it once, and then they've made adjustments, they've flexed, they've learned from their mistakes, and they've done it twice. And then the same process repeated over and over again. Lather, rinse, repeat. And that is truly how to scale a business in the Amazon world. It is a lot easier in our space than in a lot of other competitive markets that I can think of. The idea that you can get all of the free resources on how to launch a product from Jungle Scout or something like that. You can do this thing with just a few $1,000s cash. You can get going, you can get a product, and then you can just hit repeat. And you can learn each time incrementally and grow the business. And, that's where I am personally, Keith. I want to get to 50 to 100 products by the end of the year, private label products, because of pressing repeat. But I do get held up. The biggest thing that holds me up is cash. It's a challenge when, you're only making so much money, but your vision for the company is so much greater. So I've thought, what could I do? I could raise capital. What are my options? But it'd be nice to dig into a bit of that, Keith, because I know that's an area that you have a lot of expertise in. How can we use cash to work for us? What are our options?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's to a large degree, following the Amazon example is a good one. You look at what Amazon has done over the years, and they have poured their profit, or what otherwise would be their profit, back into the business. I believe that the number is at this point in time that Amazon is spending $17 billion on R&D. Which is one of, if not the largest R&D budget in the entire U.S. And that didn't happen overnight. It didn't start that way. It started very small, but they started reinvesting those profits back into growth. And so, depending on how large you want to grow your business, as you get the profits from the first product, then it's about taking those and expanding them to the next product and the next product and the next product, rather than just realizing the profits there, being able to turn that into growth is something that can certainly accelerate growth significantly.
Yeah, and we've got to have cash for this. So I think we should dig into the next slide and keep moving as we start talking about cash. Yeah,
so a couple of, and this is kind of just a recap of what we've talked about, the 5 different strategies. But to your point, cash is at the center of all of them. And so let me jump to, let's jump ahead to 4 of the kind of the categories or areas that we see where sellers are likely to be getting their financing and getting their capital. And I think there's a difference between the kind of the startup capital. How do I get my initial capital, which may only be a couple of $1,000s in order to be able to get a first product and be able to start to sell, versus how do I then figure out how to be able to create this flywheel where I have ongoing cash flow and I can repeatedly put that cash flow back in my business and scale it and grow it. So we can talk a little bit about both of those and how all 4 of these may work together, and they're not mutually exclusive at all. In fact, the sellers that we see that are really successful have used 3, if not all 4 of these that you see on the screen right now: Amazon lending, credit cards, loans, and payability.
Cool. Okay, well, let's talk about how these work, because to be perfectly honest, I think a lot of the audience may not have spent a lot of time thinking about these alternative solutions, and maybe haven't spent a lot of time thinking about how critically important good cash flow is to their business. So I'm excited to dig in deeper.
Yeah. So Amazon lending, we can start with that. I'll just say it's great. It really is. Amazon has the data, they have the insight. They're providing capital to sellers that they want to help grow, and in areas where they want more product and more inventory, so that will spur additional inventory and products, so that they can make sure they're meeting the demands of their customers. So the challenge with it is that it's a little bit lumpy. It's you're not quite sure if you're going to get an offer. You're not quite sure if you're going to qualify. If you do qualify, it's probably a great opportunity. You do want to make sure that you can actually use those funds, though, because it's generally a very quick payback period of time. And so if you're going to get a big chunk of cash, if you can't deploy that cash in a relatively fast manner in order to grow your business, then it's going to be sitting there in your bank account, earning you interest. You might be sleeping a little bit better at night, but not when you start thinking about the fact that this has to be paid back, over a relatively short period of time. So generally speaking, any sort of loan or one kind of lump sum of cash is going to work better if you can purchase large quantities of inventory at once, or if you can kind of do step function type activities where you can actually deploy that capital relatively quickly.
Okay, makes sense with the Amazon lending program. Personally, I've never used it. I'd be curious to know if anybody attending the webinar today has used it. We'd love to hear your thoughts about Amazon lending as we move on to the next option.
So the next option is credit cards. This is kind of the classic way I think that a lot of us start our businesses. I know my very first business that I started, I I started, I had perfect credit, and I started applying for every credit card I could possibly get my hands on. I was relatively fresh out of college, and I effectively maxed out all those credit cards on buying all the startup costs. And so it is not an economical way to have startup costs. It's not necessarily the smartest play long term for your personal credit, but a lot of times that is what is utilized in order to be able to either get you through a short-term crunch or to do your initial startup costs. It's not necessarily a great way to be able to long-term fund your business unless you have that repeatable cash flow and you're able to be paying those down or paying those credit cards off entirely on a monthly basis. So we definitely suggest that it's sometimes a very good way to get started, sometimes a great way to get yourself through a tight spot. If you can utilize credit cards to be able to and pay them off on a monthly basis, that's good, but they're probably not going to scale to the size that you're going to need to be able to really have a significant impact on your business once you get to the point where, like where you're at, you're going to need more financing than typically what a credit card is going to be able to provide for you.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, what's next?
So next is get a loan. And this is a challenge. It's so much easier said than done. Banks are typically going to require 3 years of stable history. And the challenge is banks are not used to seeing businesses like Amazon sellers, where Amazon sellers are typically growing way faster than the typical business that a bank is comfortable financing. And so if a bank comes to you and says, hey, you've been in business for 3 years, you have good credit, you've paid all of your suppliers as expected, and you have a profitable business, then we can make you a loan. We're going to look at your last 12 months of profits, and we're going to give you a loan based on that. Meanwhile, you're thinking, wow, I'm going to 3x my business in the next 12 months. So looking at the last 12 months doesn't really help me because you're trying to fund the size of my business 12 months ago, not the size of my business that it is now and what I need it to be. So it can be very inexpensive capital. It can be very, very helpful. It also has some of the same characteristics of Amazon lending, that if you get a big chunk of cash, you need to then be able to think about how can I actually deploy this capital in a way that is going to intelligently help me grow my business rather than just sitting on my balance sheet or sitting in my bank and accruing almost no interest. So you need to be able to use the capital, but you also need to be thinking about it in terms of, is this really going to be able to be enough capital to help me go where I'm going versus is it just enough capital to help fund where I was last year?
Yeah, and one thing that we haven't really talked about as we've been mentioning scale and growth is that momentum is critically important. As sales are starting to generate, as you're launching successful products, you don't want to delay. You want to get the next product going as quickly as you can. You want to gain and utilize momentum and speed. And that's where these financial impediments really show themselves for the first time, because maybe you don't have any issues supporting the $2,000 business that you get going using your credit card. But once you're trying to talk about 10 products, 20 products, 30 products, and maybe you're trying to launch several at the same time, all of a sudden, credit cards become a bit of a challenging solution. So, you're thinking, do I go to the bank? You're talking about using Amazon lending. I'm curious, Keith, just from those three solutions before we get to the last solution, any kind of insight as to which would be the most financially viable, in the medium term, for somebody who's thinking about scaling right now? Maybe there's a person who's listening to this right now and is thinking, yeah, I would also love to scale my business, but I'm a little bit cash strapped. Which solution should I go for? Which one do you think would be the most financially viable for 6 month to 12-month period, which is what most people are thinking about, the next kind of 6 months of their seller life?
Yeah, it's kind of tough because those three, credit cards are the most obvious that most folks probably have access to be able to get some amount of capital. It's expensive capital. You need to be careful that you don't get out over your skis. It's probably not going to provide a lot of capital, but it is sometimes a decent way to get started. A loan from a bank is one thing. Vast majority of companies are not going to qualify, especially if you're in those early months or years of having started. But maybe you're blessed enough to have a rich Uncle Harry who's going to give you a nice low interest loan and be very accommodating. So that's certainly friends and family is often a place where a lot of our sellers do start. And then certainly if Amazon is going to provide a loan, then that's something that I would take advantage of as well. Challenge is that you just don't know if it's going to come, and if it does come, you're not quite sure if it's going to continue to come. So you can't necessarily build your business based on an assumption that you'll eventually get an Amazon loan. If it does fall in your lap, it's a wonderful thing to be able to take advantage of to kind of augment the other forms of financing that you may have in place.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. So I can kind of see the strengths and the weaknesses with each one of these solutions. To be perfectly honest, as kind of like a fiscally conservative guy, none of these really jump out to me as something that I'm truly excited about taking on. I'm not really loving the idea of getting a new loan or not being able to pay off my credit cards. These are things that as a small business owner, I'm thinking could be the death of me. What other solutions do we have out there, Keith?
Well, I'm glad you asked. That was a nice setup. Thank you. So Payability, we started Payability, as I kind of mentioned at the top of the webinar, really to solve this particular problem. And the idea is to create sustainable cash flow for sellers and really for suppliers of digital marketplaces, generally speaking. But as you and I have talked about, we have kind of some of the same opportunity and challenge that a lot of our sellers have, where they may be trying to diversify outside of Amazon, but Amazon is growing so rapidly and we're finding so much demand from sellers within the Amazon community that this really is where the bulk of our focus is and has been for the last year. So we love working with Amazon sellers. It's a perfect fit for our platform. It is the vast majority of our business at this point in time, and everybody in our company at this point in time has had to become experts as Amazon experts and understanding the seller ecosystem. But really, the solution is quite simple, which is that rather than waiting 2 weeks to get paid from Amazon, based on your sales, which the vast majority of sellers are kind of stuck in that world, we just pay sellers on a daily basis. So if you sell $1,000 worth of product on Monday, you can log into your Payability account Tuesday morning. You can see that those funds are there in your Payability account. You have access to 80% of those funds, and you can deposit those funds same day right directly into your bank account. And that allows you to then be able to turn around and be able to deploy that capital very, very rapidly rather than having to wait 2 weeks in order to get paid. So we see a lot of times, we'll see this graph of our sellers that we work with, kind of the before chart of their sales is this kind of, it spikes every 2 weeks and then it slowly just kind of, comes down as that inventory is sold. And then all of a sudden when they start working with Payability, that inventory is much more steady, it's much more stable, they're able to start to do incremental buys, they're managing their inventory much tighter, and they're ultimately managing for profit rather than just for margin, and it creates a sustainable ongoing ability to be able to actually grow their business.
Wow, that's it sounds like a very powerful tool.
Yeah, and from a qualification standpoint, the other thing that's really interesting about it is that it's smart for banks to require that a company that they're going to do business with has 2 or 3 years of history. But in our world, it's okay that a seller has only been working with Amazon or only been selling on Amazon for 90 days. As long as they've been selling for 90 days, if they're in good standing with Amazon, they're doing at least $2,000 a month in sales, then they qualify to get paid on a daily basis from Payability. So the other kind of aspect of this is that as you're starting, as you're in those early days, being able to get some initial capital to be able to buy that initial chunk of inventory, and then as those sales start to come in, being able to take those sales and the cash from those sales, turn it back into inventory very, very quickly, allows that flywheel to start being able to spin much faster and allow you to be able to really have predictable, sustainable growth over a long period of time.
Yeah, for people thinking about speed to market that really want to build these businesses quick as it's becoming more and more competitive, I see this as a wonderful tool. And Kit just says that he shared in the chat box there that he's got a loan from Chase pretty recently. I'd be curious to know, Ankit, if you're a newer Amazon seller or if you were in the process of scale and if you were using that loan as a solution to scale. But it seems to me it would be highly powerful to partner a new loan if you're really serious about that growth with something like Payability that's going to give you quicker access to your funds, because that's really what it's about. It's about access to your cash so that you can use your cash to work for you. You can't do much with it when it's sitting in Amazon's accounts for 2 weeks or so each time you're waiting to be paid. So it sounds like a really great tool, Keith. Thanks for sharing that. Any concluding statements about everything we've talked about today?
When you were talking earlier about kind of expanding into other products, it reminded me of a story when I was, this was now been 16 years ago, when my second child was getting ready to be born, and I was commenting to my very close friend. I said, I don't know how I'm going to be ready to deal with 2 children. And he made this great comment where he said, nothing prepares us for having 2 children like having 1 child. And similarly, nothing prepares us for having 3 like having 2. And I think that if we think about our Amazon seller business in the same way, which is you get one product out there, you figure out how to be able to make it work, that will prepare you to be able to then do it a second time, do it a third time, and really be able to then create an ongoing, scalable, successful business. And really, that's what we're here for, is to try to help folks do that, and whether that's by using our service or by providing feedback from other winning strategies that we see. We love seeing that, and we want to be able to help sellers do exactly that.
That's great. Okay, well, I think we've covered all of the major strategies that we were going to talk about today as it relates to scale. I'm now critically aware of everybody's time, so we're coming up on about 5 minutes until the end of the hour. So I think, Keith, we're good with the slide deck presentation there. Why not just stop sharing the screen so we can see your face one more time, and let's just have kind of a last chance to take any parting shots from the audience. If anybody has any questions, Keith and I would love to field them now, whether they're about the Payability service and what it is to use your cash as a tool, or any other questions about scaling your Amazon business. We're all yours for the next 5 or so minutes before we close out this webinar right on time, right on the hour. Okay, well, I'm seeing from Ankit that Ankit had a pretty good relationship with the Chase Bank there. It seemed like it worked pretty quickly for him, and he's already ordered another product. So that's great, Ankit. I think that sounds like you've used one of the strategies here that our man Keith was talking about. So it's really great to hear. But any other questions, you guys, relating to scaling the business, relating to cash? I know that I've got one for you, Keith. How frequently do you recommend that Amazon sellers kind of take a look at their accounts receivable? How frequently should Amazon sellers be thinking about their cash flow? And do you have any kind of like blanket recommendations for how they should manage or look at their cash flow?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on if you have other channels that you're selling outside of Amazon. So it's a little simpler if you're only selling within Amazon, or 95% plus of your sales are happening within Amazon. Then everything that you need to think about from a cash flow and cadence perspective all has to do with kind of that 2-week time frame. If you're new to Amazon, if you started selling since June of last year, then you can get paid on a daily basis. But the problem is that's actually even slower than the normal 2-week cadence, because what it means is you can request to get a payment on a daily basis, but they'll only pay you for items that have actually been shipped and received and have been in the customer's hands for at least a week. And oftentimes they will hold over significant amounts. So if you're a new seller and you're brand new within the last year, you probably have even more challenges for cash flow. And sometimes it's difficult to predict it, because sometimes Amazon will just do a holdback based on a variety of different things. So be prepared for potential holdbacks on Amazon's part. Be prepared for potential suspensions, and make sure that you have the cash flow and a cash flow structure in place where you can withstand those and that doesn't kill your business. And then certainly if you are selling on other channels as well, just being very aware of how long it takes you to get paid, because we talk to a lot of sellers who say, wow, I started to scale, it was really great, I was super profitable, and I couldn't figure out why I was out of cash. And of course, as you scale and as you get that momentum, what that just means is it's going to put more pressure on your short-term cash, and you may be profitable, and you may be really nicely profitable, but you need that cash flow to be able to keep up with those purchases, because you're not collecting that cash typically on a daily basis. Of course, that's why we would suggest using Payability to make sure you are getting paid on a daily basis. But without that, you are oftentimes going to have very lumpy cash flow.
Great. Yeah, makes a ton of sense. I guess people should be paying attention to their cash flow statements. One of the pinnacle, accounting mechanisms that people can use. You can Google a cash flow statement. We won't get into that boring subject at the moment, but have a look. People should have a cash flow statement, and they should be having a look at this stuff on a very regular basis.
And they should use a system and an accounting tool that plugs into Amazon and actually understands Amazon. And that's obviously really critical. So Fetcher is obviously a fantastic tool for being able to help manage those things.
Cool. Okay, so there are a few more questions about scale before we close this out. A couple people have asked, with capital aside, how many products can be launched in a given year? And then with capital as a tool, how many products could be launched every year? And I'd say the sky is the limit. I couldn't give a specific number. I could talk to what I've done if that's of interest to people. I have been able to launch upwards of 5 products in about 2 months. So that's about the fastest I've ever done. I've launched about 5 products in about 2 months, and that's with good, adequate cash flow. If I didn't have the dependable sales of prior products, then I would not have been able to do this as quickly as I had. And to be honest, I've been in the game for a little while, and so I've built up some success as a seller, and now I'm able to depend on that cash. But I'm thinking about what it would have been like a year ago when I really should have been scaling my business much faster than I did. It's a big takeaway for me. I wish I had scaled much faster. I'd be looking for capital, and I'd be looking at it through the means of my own finances, the means of a tool like Payability, something that's going to give me the ability to access my cash more quickly so I can reinvest it. But I don't think it's outside of the limitations of a smart Amazon seller to launch, 20 products a year. If somebody's really aggressive and on the ball, depending on how much time you're spending, whether this is a side business for you or this is a full-time gig. But that would probably be my kind of blanket answer to you there, Andrew Lowe. Thanks for all the questions that you've had. I think it's possible to do that with legitimate cash flow, but you're going to have quite a bit of cash to launch 20 products, private label products. Yeah, I'm going to move on to a few more questions, Keith. Sorry, just in the last few seconds. Andrew's asking me what the revenue is. I'm a 6-figure seller at the moment, Andrew. That's about where I am, and the revenue from those 5 products wouldn't be that much, but I don't know, it's probably around $60K for those 5 products, if I had to guess. I'm just speaking to 5 products that I launched last year, so I'd have to check what they were at the time when I launched them, but something like 50 or 60K in gross margin, probably close to 6 figures in revenue. Okay, a few other questions are, what advice do you have for sellers who are considering using outside marketing to drive traffic to their pages? I don't know if you know anything about, the outside marketing game, Keith. We've got our social media rep who's talking to you all right now, our social media manager, Amelia, and she is the queen of social media. So I think social media can be a really good tool. Instagram and Facebook ads, as you've referenced here. But generally speaking, I'm a tried and true believer in Amazon's internal pay-per-click. It is such a good platform that I think it's not necessary to use outside social media platforms to launch a private label product. We're in this era where it's pretty hard to build like long-lasting, sustainable brands. It's harder now than probably ever before in the retail space. So if you can just really kill it on Amazon and spend your time optimizing your Amazon pay-per-click advertisements and focus on getting reviews and all these things that we talk about on a regular basis around the Fetcher world, I think you can be successful without outside social media platforms and advertising. Any thoughts on that, Keith?
Yeah, I would agree completely. My lights go off here, and I'm trying to turn them back on. Amazon has plenty of eyeballs. It's not a challenge to try to get more people to the Amazon platform. It's really a challenge of trying to get those folks that are at Amazon to be able to then pay attention to and ultimately purchase your product. So while it may be nice to try some of those strategies, and it may be good in order to be able to help build your brand long term, and some of those things, those basic off of Amazon platform strategies may be good to employ. Generally speaking, it's a little bit like bringing sand to the beach. There's already plenty of sand there, and so optimize the sand that's at the beach already.
Well said. So I know we're over the hour right now, but there's still some questions rolling through. So I am going to bring these questions to Keith. So Rob says that he's a little bit confused about this idea we were talking about relating to optimizing profits versus margin. He's asking, what does that mean exactly? He's basically asking, is it better to lower your price so that you get more sales velocity? Or is it better not to do that for the sanity of margin, I think, or for the sake of his inventory turns? Can you take a shot at that, Keith? What were we talking about earlier when we were saying we want to optimize for profit versus margin?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so it starts with a simple math equation. Figure out how much you can sell if you're just optimizing for margin, and how much you can sell if you are optimizing just for profit. So kind of back to my very simple, kind of silly example of, if I can only sell 1 widget per month, but I can sell it for $10, and I can end up with 50% margin, or I can sell 3 of those widgets, and I can sell each of them though, say and I only have a $3 margin on each one of those widgets. I'm going to end up generating more in profit by selling 3 than I am by selling 1. But that's just the beginning of it, because then from there, where it goes is some of the other things that we talked about, where once you start selling more volume, then it gives you the pricing power to be able to go back to your suppliers and hopefully negotiate better pricing. So that gives you, certainly you could do that when you have high volume. Very difficult to do when you have low volume. The other piece about it, though, too, is that if your strategy is to be high volume, you generally are going to have much more predictable business, rather than if you are going to have spottier sales that are just much higher margin type sales. That is not, it's much more difficult to build a sustainable business in that world versus a lower margin but higher profit and higher volume business where you have predictable sales. You're constantly in the buy box, or you have a really good quality private label product, and you have relatively consistent sales, and you know what those sales are going to look like into the future. So much more sustainable, and the kind of thing that can give you buying power. But it starts with just that simple math equation. How much can you sell if you are going to lower your margin a bit, and will you ultimately end up with more profit when you sell more of those items?
Great. Yeah, great question, Rob. And if you do have more questions about specific topics that Keith's talked about, Keith, would you mind advertising an email address, maybe for customer support, or some way that people can reach out to you on social media, or however you'd like them to, if they'd like to continue this conversation with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say you're welcome to go to payability.com. We have a wonderful sales team. One of the things that we also do and we believe in is we believe in automation, and so we are happy to help. We're happy to get on the phone. We're happy to walk folks through various things and Payability. We've also made it very self-serve and very easy to just go and sign up and go through that process. So just like when you go to Amazon, if you're going to become a seller, you don't have to pick up the phone and talk to somebody at Amazon in order to get started. It's nice to know that you can get a hold of somebody if you want to. I'll say that we're a lot easier to get a hold of than somebody at Amazon, but we do take the same approach where we want to make it so you can self-serve, where you can go through the process and get signed up. So we've made it and spent a lot of time and energy trying to create a process where it's easy to get signed up, easy in order to be able to get active. A lot of our sellers sign up and get active within a 24-hour period of time.
Great. Okay, well, I'll take the last question from Mr. Josh Watkins. Josh is asking this all-important question about expanding to other FBA markets, and that is an important strategy when we're talking about scale and growth. We probably should have thought of that. I should have thought of that and definitely talked about it, because that is a question that people are talking about a lot right now. So it sounds like Josh sells in the US, but he's also interested in expanding potentially to Mexico and Canada for growth, the other North American regions. And he's asked, is this a good idea? And my short answer, this is going to be a little bit tough. You're putting me on the spot. My short answer is look elsewhere. Look to other marketplaces. Okay, there's not a lot of activity in Mexico and Canada at the moment on the Amazon space. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to change soon, and perhaps it would be very beneficial to be on the front end. But my gut tells me that it's still best, if you're thinking about scale, you're thinking about growth, in the more short term. Think about Europe, think about the UK, think about Germany. And then there's also this great program called the Pan-European program, where you can keep your inventory in the UK and you can sell to all 5 marketplaces. So that's Spain, it's Italy, it's France, Germany, and then of course the UK as well. So the short answer is that I'm not personally, if you're curious about that side of the house, I'm not personally selling in Canada or in Mexico, because the numbers aren't really there yet from what I see for my products. But it's possible that that's not the case for your products, Josh. So, I'll just leave it at that. And I think we can close out the webinar with that thought there, Keith. Got several people in the webinar thanking you for your time. Looks like, and Keith says that he's really thankful for the time and input and for everything that we've done. Guys, our idea here was to come and give a free webinar because we want to talk about content. We want to talk about the stuff we really care about, which is, what do Amazon sellers need to be successful? On the Fetcher side, we're talking about accounting, we're talking about bookkeeping. And then, of course, on Keith's side, the payability side, we're talking about increasing cash flow, getting you your money, the money that you've rightfully earned, so that you can turn it around and grow and scale your business. Keith, any parting shots for the audience?
No, other than this has been a lot of fun. I love talking about this. I love talking about helping sellers grow. So it's been a ton of fun. Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone, thanks so much for joining. You are all going to get a replay video sent to you in the next probably 24 hours or so, maybe a little earlier than that. Probably by tomorrow morning, you'll have a nice, refined, edited version of this that you can go to on YouTube and rewatch if there's strategies that we talked about that maybe we moved on too quickly. If you have questions for the Fetcher side of the house, please contact us at support@fetcher.com. We're willing and ready to take your questions and your calls, and we'll continue the conversations personally that way. Keith, one more time, thank you so much for coming and for sharing your insights. And to the rest of the audience, we will see you all next time. So